Hi everyone! This series of video tutorials is designed to help you get a brief introduction of how to work in Adobe Illustrator. I would advise that you watch these tutorials in order, and I'll number them so you can keep track, because as I introduce tools and move forward, I'll be referring to things in past videos. So it's best if you don't skip around too much unless you're really comfortable with Illustrator and well versed in all of the tools. I'll be starting with very basic work and eventually working my way up to more advanced tips and techniques. This is the window you'll see when you first open Adobe Illustrator. If you've got files that you had opened in the past, you'll see them down here. And you're always going to want to start by saying Create New. I usually make my documents 8.5 by 11, and I put them in portrait mode. It was really important, the canvas size in Photoshop, but now that we're working in Illustrator, we're going to be working in what's called vector design, and it's not so important the size that you work in, because as I'll show you in a minute, you can always change your size and scale, and it's not going to harm the quality of the work that you're doing. Unlike Photoshop, where if you start working really small and then you try to scale it up, you'll end up with a really pixelated looking image. The bleed, I'm going to leave as 0. This is something where if you're working with printing, you normally don't design all the way to the edge of the paper, because most printers can't print right up to the edge of the paper. So you want to leave a little bleed in your design, or just blank space where it doesn't matter if that part of the image isn't printed out perfectly. I'm going to make mine 8.5 by 11, portrait orientation, and I only want one artboard. It should be already set to this as a default. Once I have those settings, and that's all I need, normally we did resolution and we would set that here with Photoshop. Again, that doesn't matter with Illustrator because we're working in vector design. So now I'm going to click Create, and I have my blank canvas to start working in. What we call this within Illustrator is an artboard. So if we ever want to adjust it, the Artboard tool is over here. It looks like this. When I hover over it, it says Artboard tool and it shows me the keyboard shortcut. I can click on that and I can readjust or change my artboard in any way that I want. This is basically my workspace for creating my image. I'm going to do Command Z to undo. And if I want to be precise about how I'm changing it, I can change the measurements up here. I can say I want this to actually be 10 inches by 11 inches, and I hit return. I can click this to lock the ratio of height to width, and now when I change this one to 5 inches, the height will scale accordingly when I hit enter. If I change it back to 10, return, it scales accordingly. I'm going to unlock it so I can change this back to 8.5 and hit enter. So that's my workspace. Anything that I put in my artboard, if I send this to print, all of the things on the artboard will print. Anything in the gray on the outside won't print. So you can use the gray as a workspace where you can have ideas or objects that you're not using at the moment but you might want to pull in later, and then just know it's not going to print in your final image. To get out of it, you can click on the selection tool. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, but the first thing that I wanted to show you was raster design versus vector design. I've pulled in 4 pictures of a cute little poodle puppy, and the reason I did this was I wanted to use these images to show you the difference between raster and vector images. The easiest way to spot the difference is to zoom way in on an image. So there are 2 ways I can zoom. I can use the trackpad and spread my 2 fingers apart to zoom in on an image. There's also a magnifying glass over here, the zoom tool. I can click on that and then click on my image and keep clicking to zoom in. Notice how as I zoom in on this puppy picture, it gets really pixelated. That tells me that this is a raster image. Now, if I want to zoom back out, I can pinch two fingers together on the trackpad, or I can hold down Option with my zoom tool and get the minus sign. And now when I click, I zoom out. I can come over to this puppy image and let's zoom in on this one and see if this is raster or vector. Zooming. Oh, it's getting pixelated, so I can tell this one is also a raster image. Option, zoom tool to zoom out. Now look at this one next to it. It looks the same as the other puppy picture, but what you didn't see was I turned this into a vector image. So even though it still looks like this one, if we zoom in on this guy, it seems like it's pixelated, but what this actually is a series of shapes. And each of these shapes has really distinct and clear edges. And so as I get closer and closer, they aren't blurry, they actually are really crisp. And that's how I know that this is a vector image. So think of vector images as being composed of a series of editable shapes rather than a series of pixels. I'm going to go over this in more detail later, but I just want to show you quickly that I can edit these shapes. So if I come in with a selection tool, I can actually take a point of this and drag it out and change any of the shapes on this at any time. I could never do this with pixels inside a raster image. Now let's look at this last puppy here. This is really simplified, but I want you to focus on the edges. So if I zoom in on the edge of this image, notice how it's always crisp and clean. No matter how much I zoom in, that edge is always a nice straight line. If this were a raster image, this would get pixelated even if it looked like a clean straight line. The more I zoomed in and zoomed in, I'd start to see those little pixels blur. So vector images can still be really complicated. They don't have to be super simple like this puppy here. But all it means is as I zoom in, zoom in, zoom in, and I see these shapes, they have really clean, crisp edges. Let's go to an edge here. Notice that. Let's try that with a raster image. Zoom in, zoom in, zoom in. And what I'm seeing is pixels instead of shapes. And sure, those pixels have clean edges to them, but I can't edit them or adjust them. So it's always going to be blurry. That's the really basic difference between raster and vector images. What that means more importantly is that vector images are scalable. I can take these puppies and make them any size. I could print this puppy on a billboard and it would print looking exactly how I wanted it to look. And notice how as I click on it, you can see all the tiny shapes that make it up. If I printed this puppy or the other one on a billboard, it would be really, really blurry. So in order to get an image or a photograph good enough to print on a billboard, I'd have to have a really, really fancy high resolution camera. Whereas if I'm dealing with vector images, I don't need high resolution. They take up less data. So a billboard-sized raster image would take up a ton of memory on your computer. A billboard-sized vector image would not. So that's why companies and designers use vector images for logos, for product design, because it is scalable. I can have this exact same puppy, and forgive the background, I just didn't clean it up. I can have this exact same puppy on a business card, on a letterhead, on an advertisement, on a billboard, and it can be the exact image every time. Whereas if I were using a photograph, a raster image, I would have to get different resolution and different quality for each. Otherwise, the file would just be too big. Same with this puppy. This could be printed anywhere and it would look exactly the same. I'd have no surprises about how it turned out. So that's why we use vector design. That's why vector design is powerful. You can have really detailed files that don't take up nearly as much memory as a design with equal detail in a raster file, and it can be printed at any size. So that's why the size doesn't matter so much as we're working in Adobe Illustrator, because it can be adjusted at any time. I like to work in 8.5 and 11 by 11 because that's a typical sheet of paper. And to me, that just in my mind translates most easily. So I know how big that image is going to be when it's printed out. If you feel more comfortable with a different size, absolutely use that as your artboard. It's not a big deal, and you can always change it later.